And we have a former U.S. ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker, standing by for more. But first, let's get the latest on the war in Ukraine with NBC News international correspondent Molly Hunter, who's live for us in London. Molly, good morning to you. So Secretary of State Marco Rubio got to Saudi Arabia this morning. What's the latest on the talks that are set to take place there, and where does Ukraine fit into them?
Stephen, good morning. And you just heard from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that certainly Ukraine needs to fit into any negotiations, and we have no sense and no indication that Ukraine is going to be present at these talks happening in Saudi Arabia. What we know from the State Department is that Secretary of State Marco Rubio arrived just about an hour ago, touched down blue skies in Riyadh. White House National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff are also accompanying Rubio on this. They will meet with a Russian delegation led by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov starting tomorrow. What exactly the agenda is, we do not have any details, Stephen. No European leaders, no Ukrainian leaders at the table, at least at our understanding at this time. Now, two U.S. officials tell NBC News that the intention is there will be kind of a bilateral with Russia, which this looks like happening in Saudi Arabia, then a bilateral with Ukrainian leaders, and then they get the two sides together. But European leaders, and we heard a lot from European leaders at the end of last week at the Munich Security Conference over the weekend, feel completely left out as the U.S. sets the tone and the pace of these pre-negotiations. Now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio was speaking with CBS yesterday. Take a quick listen because he made a point that some of his colleagues in the administration didn't.
He thinks this war needs to end. And if he sees an opportunity to end it, which is what he's looking for, whether there is an opportunity or not, we're going to pursue it. Ultimately, it will reach a point when if it's real negotiations, and we're not there yet, but if that were to happen, Ukraine will have to be involved because they're the one that were invaded. And the Europeans will have to be involved because they have sanctions on Putin and Russia as well.
So Ukraine has to be at the table. Europe has to be at the table, according to Secretary of State. Neither have been invited to these talks or these pre-negotiations, perhaps in Riyadh. Stephen?
Molly, talking about Europe being shut out of this, obviously Ukraine feels shut out of this as well. But do European leaders have any strategy that we know of to come up with their own plans or to try to insert themselves into the U.S. and Russia's talks?
There are ongoing, I should say, discussions happening right now in Paris today. After last week and over the weekend, European leaders got together realizing they did need to kind of speak without the U.S. and come up with an action plan of sorts. So in Paris, President Emmanuel Macron has invited European leaders, NATO representatives, EU representatives. We know UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer will be there. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz will be there. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk and other leaders from Europe. The goal, as I mentioned, come up with an action plan as the U.S. charges ahead here, but also to have real conversations about security guarantees. Because the security guarantees, and you heard President Zelensky speak about this in his interview with Kristen Welker, will fall to Europe either individually to countries or in the form of a future NATO membership for Ukraine. So that's all happening in Paris. We've got the U.S. and Russia all in Saudi Arabia, and we will keep you posted on what we learn from both of those places.
Yeah, a lot of moving targets as well here. Molly, thanks so much for that. Ambassador Volker, let's get your perspective here. On Friday, Vice President J.D. Vance took the opportunity to criticize Europe for censoring right-wing views and for its immigration policies instead of really focusing on the war in Ukraine. So how big of a shift is this for U.S. foreign policy, and how much of an ally do you think these NATO countries still view the U.S.?
Well, I was there in Munich for the speech and observing some of the reaction. Vice President Vance gave a speech that was more political and philosophical about democracy in the West. And of course, that's seen from a MAGA perspective in contrast to a woke or progressive perspective. And we've gone through that political battle in the U.S. over the past several years. And Europe has a version of that as well, with its own far-right parties and its own establishment parties. And the Europeans didn't appreciate Vice President Vance pushing them on this, especially 1 week before the German election. So there was a lot of frustration and upset over that. And they were also surprised that he didn't really talk much about foreign policy or national security at this conference, which is convened for the purpose of talking about that. But that being said, I wasn't really surprised that that's where Vance went. That's his political makeup. That's where he's coming from. What he's lived through for the past many years. And at the same time, he's not the one calling the shots on foreign policy and national security. That's President Trump. And it would have been odd, I think, for him to be giving a foreign policy message in Munich while President Trump is back in Washington, calling Putin, calling Zelensky, setting up meetings in Saudi Arabia, and so forth.
Yeah, President Trump as well wanted to ask you about this. He's threatened to pull out of NATO before. So when you look at how the new administration is going, sometimes sidelining its allies, reestablishing these direct talks with Russia. We also know the U.S. has withdrawn from the World Health Organization, which Trump has also threatened. When you hear all this together, for you, does it call into question whether or not the United States will continue to be a member of NATO?
Not at all. President Trump himself has said many times the purpose of this is to get our allies to do their share. He talks about, oh, the U.S. may not be there, we may pull out, as a threat in order to get the allies to spend more, in order to strengthen European security. And he did this in his first term when only 3 countries were spending 2% of GDP on defense. That number is now 23 of the European allies. And he wants them to spend even more because the threats are greater now from Russia. There's an active war. So he's pushing them and pushing them. And I would just note, too, that Marco Rubio was the senator who sponsored legislation in the Senate that says it would require a Senate vote for the U.S. to pull out. And I don't think it's President Trump's intention. And even if he did, I don't think it would actually go through.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.